Pretoria. Maybe I should also not say when I started lecturing. I didn't start lecturing in the 80s, but a couple of years thereafter I did start. So I've been my whole career, I've been with one foot in academia and one foot in industry. So in that regard, I might be considered similar to Roelof, where he said he's not I think he said proper academic. I do think he is, by the way, but maybe not a traditional academic. And so what I'm saying today is my views on this postgraduate teaching and learning experience. So I'm focusing a bit more on fully on postgraduate, but it's my view. So it's not an official departmental view. It's what I've seen, and it's what I'm trying to do. And of course, I'm open for any comments in this regard. Let me see if this one. Okay, let's leave the layout. Let's go to a bit of an introduction. So I always ask my question, this whole teaching and learning process, I mean, we speak about T&L quite frequently at the university. Where's this taking us? I mean, where do we want to go? Where does the market want us? So I think it is a market environment coming from economics in the context of there's the academic process and there's the industry out there. And we're training students to go and do their bit in industry. We sometimes think we train students only for academia, and we're not. The bulk is going into industry. We need to ask ourselves, where are students when they enter our programs? And at the University of Pretoria, we debate that frequently. And without saying this officially, I don't think we really know where the students are academically when they enter the program. I mean, we know they've got a BCom or a BSc degree and so on and so forth. But the precise point, of course, that is almost impossible, but we don't have a good idea of where they are. I always have been of the opinion that the students, we want them to be streetwise. And what I mean by streetwise, I know it's not an official academic word. As a matter of fact, it's probably a horrible word. But precisely where Roelof was coming from, you have the theory on the one side and you have data on the other side. And if we need to get the students exposed to make that transition from theory into the data, or from the data getting back to the theory. And quite recently, I attended a session where a gentleman from University of Pretoria, is professor of mathematics. I don't know if I pronounce his surname correct, Prof. Banasiak. He actually gave a lecture on data science, and he used that reference, competency without comprehension. And I was sort of juggling with that in my mind for a long time, but I fully subscribe to that now. In our subject, we have a high risk of getting people to think they are competent without comprehending what they are busy doing. And it's again that whole idea of Inga knows my story, but at one point in time, I had a student in our department that academically a very, very strong student. Coming the mathematical stats route, but in the commerce faculty, he just recently graduated with a PhD, really, top 5% of the class. And when he ended up in one of my classes would be technically a little bit more applied. And I asked the class something very simple. Tell me a bit about your view on the central limit theorem. And he said something like, it is something that I prove from some distribution that I use to prove another distribution. And I said, what does that really mean? Or tell me what is happening in your heart. And he didn't speak to me for a month because I'm asking him from a statistical point, what is happening in your heart? He didn't relate to that. Ultimately, 5 years later, he got a PhD and we are friends now. But it is that thing of, let's not only think about the mathematical or the mathematical statistical process, but let's think about what things mean. Now, this slide that I'm sharing with you now, we need to move a bit into my world. And these diagrams are always horrible, and this one is also a horrible one. The only thing that I want to sell to you here, or sort of highlight, is that we have PhD degrees coming from two faculties, Faculty of Natural and Agricultural Science and the Economic and Management Science. And both of those get the student to a PhD, and currently, as it stands, to a PhD in mathematical statistics. There's a bit of a technicality in there. But we also lecture other faculties, one of which is the engineering faculty, which I've got there on the EBIT, which you see there to the right, where we also present some postgrad courses, but let's focus on NAS and EMS. Multiple degrees moving into, so different honors degrees, but moving into one, different names, but technically one master's program, which we call a master's program in advanced data analytics. There's another one called MSc in eScience, which you would know of, but that is, in terms of the coursework, a little bit different to ours, but in the broader scheme of things, the same thing. And that takes you to a mathematical statistics PhD program ultimately at the end. Now, thinking about this, we can just imagine the differences in terms of where the students are academically, in terms of their background. And we need to accommodate that. So that is our environment. So let me just take it then closer to what I lecture. I initially have there the word my somewhere in there, but there's a bit of a sensitivity around saying a course is mine, although I firmly believe one needs to take responsibility for course. But I present, these are 4 of the postgrad courses that I present. One in behavioral analytics at the honors level, plus minus 35 students, statistical learning, honors level, plus minus 35 students, and the master's level course in unsupervised learning, 20, and behavioral analytics, 10. And that last one is actually from the engineering faculty. Now, I don't want to compete in terms of large classes, but for a postgrad environment, 35 is, at least at our university, in the more, let's say, mathematically inclined subjects, considered to be a large number. Right. So my views on the lecturing environment is, of course, we've got many different backgrounds in here. Of course, the students coming in the traditional mathematical statistics route, they have mathematics up to somewhere in the 2nd year. They are coming through a process which also accommodates the actuarial students, which means it's much more theoretically inclined or mathematically inclined. Then we've got the students from statistics and data science, much more applied, and less mathematical for that matter. Also coming from 2 different faculties, science and commerce, but it's not like mathematical is science and applied is commerce. Both are slightly more applied in mathematical programs, is part of both faculties also. And then also, these days, in our mainstream courses, we get more and more students coming from computer science and or informatics in our environment. So what are we trying to do? What I'm trying to do in my teaching environment, I'm trying to get the students to get closer to that link between theory and industry. Statistical intuition. What are things about? One thing in terms of statistical intuition, the simple case linking to what Roelof said earlier today. If I stand in front of a class and I get to one of the supervised version of the courses, and I say to them, think regression. Let's keep it really simple. Go back undergrad. Think regression and think about the error structure in there. What will happen with the errors if you increase the sample size? And just so frequently we get students saying, okay, the errors will reduce. The errors will go to 0 as the sample approximates the population. Of course, the intuition is just totally lacking there. Enhanced algorithmic thinking. So everything that we do in the course that I present, we ultimately package as an algorithm. Similar to what Roelof said again, in terms of his process, an algorithm is just a slightly different variation on exactly the same thing. And in this process, we try to challenge the students every single time and say, what are you doing? How are you doing that? What specifically is of interest? And how do I do these things? Because, I mean, I need to be 100% honest. I haven't got all the answers. I'm not trying to say I've got all the answers. I'm just trying to say, over the years, we've got a bit of exposure and you adapt to what you see in the market out there. So all the courses that I present, those courses are driven by practical problems with a strong coding component. So I bring the coding closer. Now, many would argue, but they also do the coding, and it's fine. I will explain to you what I mean by coding. I'm not saying I'm not doing the theory. I'm not saying I'm not doing the fundamentals. Those remain important. Okay, so almost all coding that we do would be coding from first principles. In other words, if we do something like KNN mode-seeking based clustering, we code that from first principles. And I tell the students, I say, well, will you code like this, specific coding this to go into, when you go into industry? No, you'll use an R package or whatever software you want to use to do that. But they only understand it, at least to some extent, when they physically went through the process of reading, lecturing, and physically being part of that process of doing that, getting it embedded in their minds. Much better, I think, than just pressing a button. Okay, lots of focus on simulation. Luckily, the courses that I present, many of the topics there works well to demonstrate certain aspects, certain properties from simulation. Keep in mind, you can't run in here with a pure mathematical point of view, because one group, half the class roughly, hasn't got that as a background. So you need to get some common denominator. And this, in my case, the coding from first principles. I have brought in the last 5 or 6 years a little bit of animation. Typically, I guess most of my colleagues my age and older would say, you're wasting your time. Why do you want to look at animation and stats? But something like the expectation maximization algorithm, if you do a mixture of Bernoullis, and they went through the process, or a mixture of multivariate Bernoullis, go through a process of doing the theoretical derivation, and then you show them an animation, how that, if let's say we classify digits, how it actually gets that right. You see the eyes, and you can just see their eyes, even if they are senior students. Come on board. We do frequent assignments. One might argue I'm a bit overdoing it here, but over the years you can get the assignments to elegant, you update them frequently, but not every year all the assignments. I do weekly quiz tests, especially at the honors level, not weekly at the masters, but still a lot. Optimized using ClickUp, using Gradescope, using various modes that can be slightly more elegant in terms of the time required to mark that. Then I also use large, what I call large, you can interpret it as in any way you want, closed book, biased towards theoretical, and open book biased towards application tests. And in this regard, I challenge them with fairly involved problems. I've got a bit of a bee in my bonnet coming from undergrad, where the timetable process sort of strings stats together as you do theory and you do a practical session. I don't like that notion at all. I like the notion of we're doing stats. Some of that is theory and some of that would be slightly more applied, but it's not like the one and thereafter the other. It's one process. And then what I want to say here in my context, theoretical does not necessarily mean proofs. It includes that, but also your slant in terms of what are you doing? And then at the master's level, I do some oral sessions, and that I find to be worthwhile. At the end, it takes time. I know it takes time, but a student gets a take-home exam there, and they come and defend, if you want to look at this in a negative way, but just communicate what they've done, because you can quite easily see how the student thought. So I always say in those sessions, all the wrong answers can get you a good mark, and all the right answers can get you a fail, because you need to be able to convince me and the external that it's appropriate. Most of what I do has got some links, in many cases direct links to industry problems. I need to do this more, but that's what we try to do. On a frequent basis, you can't do it too much because you just got so much time. The speakers from industry to come back and relate. Sometimes previous students, they come in, they tell us what they do and what they've been confronted, because I'm not naive. What we teach students at varsity just takes you so far. I mean, the working experience out there is something, it's a different animal. A lot of consulting with students, online or in person. We do lots of online consulting also, but this takes time to run through this. Okay, a number of challenges. Managing expectations of students and industry. They come from different schools. Then we put them in one environment, schools meaning different backgrounds. We want to get them to be ready for work. We do a bit of capstone projects somewhere down the line to also embed that. We run the risk of negating some of the theoretical principles, and one needs to be cognizant of that so that you don't negate that. But I think we get that right. And can we get it better? Yes, we can. Use continuous feedback from previous students and industry. So I've got a way, just panned out like that in the past, that I have got frequent contact with a range of students. Some of them now these days already in their 40s, but some of them young, like having done their masters a year or two ago. Well, that's my story. Farah, I hope it wasn't too fast or